Mr. Fernandez, Ambassador Hrinak, Dr. Odicio, Mr. Andrews, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. How about this weather we ordered for today? What a cold snap for the 305, right? I see the boots, the leather jackets. Very nice. Before I continue, I kindly ask that all of you set your cell phones on the silent position if you haven't done so already. Thank you very much. I'm Juan Mendieta, the Director of Communications here at Miami-Dade College, and on behalf of our esteemed college president, Dr. Eduardo Padron, who wanted to be here but is traveling on college business, and also on behalf of our more than 165,000 students, welcome to Miami-Dade College and to this special facility, the groundbreaking entrepreneurial hub of the region, MDC's Idea Center. And I see the able director, Romy Batia. He was here a second ago. There he is. Romy just started recently and doing great things already here at the Idea Center. This morning, we are all extremely proud to host the next installment of the acclaimed and popular Mike Fernandez Global Business Leadership Series. Our speaker today is Donna Hrinak, Vice President of Boeing International and President of Boeing Latin America. And I know this will be such a wonderful event. I hope all of you are taking some notes in just a few minutes. What's that? Anyway. In just a few moments, I'm going to hand things off to my able colleague, Dr. Donna Hrinak, Dean of Global Business, Trade, and Transportation here at Miami-Dade College, who will formally introduce our guest and help lead the discussion. By the way, our special guest and her organization are big champions of higher education. However, I first want to once again thank a man who is truly a pillar in this community. You know, the term pillar is often thrown around loosely in conversations, but it truly applies to you, Mr. Mike Fernandez. He's a community treasure who's always distinguished himself by doing and saying the right thing courageously, even if perhaps not popular, whether speaking up in staunch support of dreamers or about issues in Washington and Tallahassee. He has always voiced his opinion and voiced the truth. Mr. Fernandez is also a stalwart champion of good causes. Speaking of causes, his philanthropy has raised the bar for all of us to follow and to emulate. Mr. Fernandez, of course, is a renowned healthcare industry businessman. As I mentioned, a great philanthropist. He is the founder of MBF Healthcare Partners and served our nation in the Army. He also completed the Way of St. James a couple of years ago to raise money for the Early Childhood Initiative Foundation. Thank you, Mr. Fernandez, for all you do and for bringing these efforts to the college. As a matter of fact, this series has allowed us to hear from Dr. Bernard Meyerson, Chief Innovation Officer at IBM, and Mr. Laxman Narasimhan, the President of PepsiCo Latin America, and today, of course, Ambassador Hrinak. So let's give Mike Fernandez a big round of applause. And now it's truly my pleasure and honor to hand things off to my new colleague, Dr. Donna Hrinak. I think after this event, I won't call you new anymore because you'll have your feet fully on the ground here at Miami-Dade College. So without any further ado, Dr. Hrinak, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan. And good morning, everyone. Really great to be here and see all these wonderful faces in the room. I'd like to welcome you today to Miami-Dade College Mike Fernandez Global Business Leadership Series. As you know, if you've attended earlier series, that it is designed to provide students with first-hand knowledge and business practices of leadership by inviting renowned executives to share their experiences and discuss new trends in their respective industry. With that, today, we are honored to have with us Donna Hrinak. She's the Vice President of Boeing International and President of Boeing Latin America. Donna has a very impressive background, both in the private and in the public sector. I would like to take a few minutes just to share with you some of the background that she brings to us today. She was appointed President of Boeing Brazil in October 2011 and President of Boeing LATAM in November 2014. She is responsible for the development and implementation of Boeing strategy in Latin America and leads company-wide activities in that region. Prior to working for Boeing, Donna was the Vice President of Global Public Policy and Government Affairs at PepsiCo. We didn't overlap when I was at PepsiCo. I wish we had. It would have been wonderful to work with you. Before PepsiCo, she worked for Kraft Foods as their corporate affairs director in Latin America and the EU. So in addition to her private sector work, she had a quite impressive private sector work. Before entering the private sector, Donna was a career officer in the U.S. Foreign Service. She served as the U.S. ambassador to Brazil, to Venezuela, to Bolivia, to the Dominican Republic, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Mexico and the Caribbean. Donna also serves on multiple boards. Boards of examples are the Council on Foreign Relationship, the Miami Cancer Hospital, and Fundação Don Cabral. Don't know if I pronounced that correctly. She is also a member of the International Women's Forum and the Organization of Women in International Trade. During those years, she has gathered many distinguished awards that include the Order of the Barão do Rio Branco from the government of Brazil and the Order of Durante Chances and Meia from the government of the Dominican Republic. She also received the Career Achievement Award from the U.S. Department of State and the Distinguished Public Servant Award from the U.S. Coast Guard. In addition, in 2005, she was named International Businesswoman of the Year by the Miami chapter of the Organization of Women in International Trade. So, as you can see, we are very honored to have Donna here, and we are very excited to hear her talk. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Donna Hrinak, who will be talking to us today about lessons learned in the private and the public sectors.
Hi, good morning. This is the hard part. Yes, okay. I always say 10 years from now, nobody will remember what I said, but you'll still be laughing if the slides don't work. So, it's really a pleasure to join all of you today, and I want to thank you for taking some of your time to be here. I also want to thank Miami-Dade College for the invitation. I'm not surprised to hear that Dr. Padron is traveling on college business. He does such a great job of going around the country and around the world, letting everyone know the amazing things that are going on here at MDC. And a special thanks to Mike Fernandez, not just for sponsoring this series, but for everything you do in the community. So, and thank you for taking your time as well to be here. Right, yeah. I did, okay. Okay, so I grew up in a working class family in Monaca, Pennsylvania. It's a small town in the western part of the state, about 25 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. And one of my strongest memories from that childhood was my dream to get out of Monaca, Pennsylvania. Right? Wasn't that I hated where I was so much as I knew there was more to the world, and I wanted to be part of it. I knew that in my heart and in my head. Now, not many people in Monaca felt the same way. So I really couldn't talk to anybody about my dream. So I did, at about the age of 9, what any young girl with a secret dream would do. I made up a story. I told my parents that I needed a globe so I could write a report for school. This is the days before internet, right? I had to have a globe because I needed to write about 10 different countries. They needed to be in different parts of the world. I had to describe it. It was all an invention, right? And I think my parents knew that. But they indulged me, and I got my globe. And that globe satisfied me for a while. But clearly, I needed to do more than study and write about places beyond Monaca. I needed to go to those places. I needed to travel. I needed to fly. And finally, I got my chance. When I was 18, I left home to go to college in Michigan. And on my first holiday from school over Thanksgiving, I flew for the first time from East Lansing, Michigan, where my university was located, go Spartans, to Pittsburgh. And I learned something very important. something I really hadn't anticipated. I was afraid to fly. Now, I get the irony, right? I was afraid to fly, and now I work for an aircraft manufacturer. Well, the reason I overcame that fear, in part, was because I learned more about the technology behind airplanes. Here's an example. This is the 787. It's Boeing's newest and most innovative aircraft. It's called the Dreamliner. Look at the wings. The wings on the 787 are much more flexible, so that even when you're going through strong turbulence with a lot of wind gusts, you don't feel as much bouncing because there's less resistance. And that's because these wings are made of carbon fiber rather than aluminum, which is the material traditionally used in aircraft production. So the wings are more flexible, they bend more. And you see the bird-like shape on the wings? That increases the pull and the lift so that you have less drag. The plane is more efficient. Birds obviously fly naturally, almost effortlessly. And that's how we want our planes to fly, too. More efficiently, which is better for the environment, and more comfort for the passengers. Now, I have to stop here, only because I say, when the slides don't work, you remember? I used this slide at a different presentation in Mexico City, but the presentation didn't work. It wasn't loaded properly. So when I got to this photo, I'm up there going, and we have this plane called the 787, and the wings look like a bird. And so I'm sure people are still talking about that one. Anyway. But obviously, there is more to flying than technology, right? Flying is about connecting. Connecting with places, connecting with experiences, connecting with each other. And more of us are making those connections. Every June, Boeing issues what we call the CMO, the Current Market Outlook, which looks at the needs of the aircraft market for the next 20 years. And you'll see from this chart, prediction is that between 2017 and 2036, the market will need over 41,000 new aircraft. That's as more and more people around the world move into the middle class, have disposable income, and use it to travel. And you'll see the big numbers, if you can see in the back, are in Asia, obviously, but it's really around the world, including in Latin America. Now, when I think of all of these people making new connections, I also think about the very special opportunities I've had to make connections throughout my career, both on the public side and now in the private sector. When I first left government, I often got the question, are there skills that are equally important for success, for effectiveness in the public sector and in private industry? And I think there are few of us have really made that transition successfully, so few that I still hear that question, and I also get a lot the question, so why did you leave? And obviously there are different ways of answering this, right? I have a friend who was in the Brazilian Foreign Service for 40 years. He left, he's now working in business, and when he's asked why he left, he answers very bluntly, I've had power and prestige, and now I want cash. My reasons for leaving were, I won't say more noble, but different anyway. I joined the Foreign Service when I was 22. I didn't want to be 65 and wonder if I could have ever done anything else, so I'm doing something else. I think people may have a hard time understanding this transition between public and private service because few people know what diplomats do. Or rather, a lot of people think they know what diplomats do, but few of those thoughts reflect the job as a whole, and many of them are woefully inadequate. Can you read the captions back there? Okay, yeah? Can everybody in the back see the captions? No, what my friends think I do lying on the beach, right? What my mom thinks I do at the UN giving tough speeches. What other governments think I do, spying. What society thinks I do, I'll come back to this one, this is my favorite. What I think I do, evacuating, right, in times of stress. And what I do, and that one's just not true. No, sleeping at your desk. This one I like the best because it shows two men with striped pants, one with a cup of coffee, tea, and it reflects the common pejorative comment that's often made about Foreign Service officers, that were striped pants cookie pushers. I spent 30 years in the Foreign Service, and I never had a job that required me to push cookies. But I did have lots of jobs that made me effective in various sectors. My first tour was in Mexico City, and I served as prisoner welfare officer at a time when we had over 600 US citizens imprisoned in Mexico. Most of them were young. Like me, I was 23 at the time, and most were in jail for carrying drugs. So I learned how to be sensitive when delivering bad news, when I had to call the families back in the States and tell them that their son or daughter had been busted. But at the same time, straightforward in giving them the facts about what they could expect and what they needed to do next. I learned to stare down a prison director who thought the US government would pay protection money for its citizens. And I learned, sadly, that a prison guard who couldn't read or write wouldn't respect a diplomatic ID, but would give me visitors access because he saw I had a credit card from a local department store, Liverpool, for any of you who know Mexico. So I must be an important person. And as I continued my career, my responsibilities ranged from defending US companies against pirated goods, or convincing US members of Congress to respect the results of free and fair elections even when they didn't like the winner, or urging the private sector in the country where I was serving to speak out more forcefully in favor of free trade. Never a cookie pushing. Nowhere around the world. There are three elements that I think were particularly important to doing well in government that also transition well into the private sector. You've got to engage, right? You've heard it before. It's all about the relationships. You've got to build the relationships. And you've got to invest early on. Don't go to somebody for the first time to ask them a favor. Make sure they know who you are. And don't always start at the top, right? You might not be able to get to the senator, but you might be able to get to that legislative aide who's going to whisper in the senator's ear when she's on her way in to cast a vote. That's the person you need to know. You need to inform. I believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I think people really want to do the best for their organization and ultimately for themselves. But they need information to do that, even if they don't want to admit it. If you can provide sound, objective, reliable information, you can help them make the decision that you want. And finally, you need to convince. Lobbying is not a four-letter word, neither literally nor figuratively, right? Lobbying is advocating. It's closing the deal. Whether you want another government to work with yours or you want a potential customer or partner to work with your company. These three elements of the way you do your job survive the transition. I want to talk about one more thing. As you've heard, I've spent most of my professional life either living in or dealing with the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And as I've traveled around the region, including here in the United States, I've convinced there is one element that is critical to the development of our hemisphere. And it's fitting that we talk about it here because that element is education. Some of you may be familiar with the PISA exams, the Assessment of International Student Achievements. When the last exams given in 2015 to 15-year-olds to measure their proficiency in math, science, and reading comprehension, Latin America came in next to the last among the regions of the world, just slightly above sub-Saharan Africa. The United States actually fell 11 points in math assessment, while reading and science remained flat. US dropped from 28th to 35th place among countries from one test to the other. Now, those of you who may be education majors know this is a complex subject, right? It takes more than a couple minutes of remarks. There's no silver bullet to solve the problems of education, but we have a pretty good idea where to start. Research in education over the last couple of decades shows that more than the school's physical plant, more than the technology in the classroom, more than the curriculum, more than the community socioeconomic status, one factor makes a difference, and that factor is teachers. I'm proud to say that Boeing works around the hemisphere to support teachers, particularly who are working in the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math. 2 weeks ago, I attended the premiere of Kitty Hawk, which is a musical that was developed by the Adrian Arch Center here with Boeing support. And as you might imagine, Kitty Hawk tells the story of the Wright brothers, right? The musical will be shown to all 7th graders in Miami-Dade Public Schools this year. And it's accompanied by a curriculum their teachers will use in the classroom to give them hands-on experience in the STEM subjects. What we really learn from Kitty Hawk is perseverance. There's a song in the musical that says, it's a lot harder going up than it is coming down. I'm sure many of you had a teacher that had an impact on your life, that made you understand why you were in school. A teacher that can take that imagination and make a student understand that it's relevant right here on the ground every day. That's really a superhero. Now, when I was 9 years old, I dreamed about getting out of Monaca, Pennsylvania. What can a 9-year-old dream about today?
Today, somewhere out there in the world, in a classroom, somewhere between the age of 10 and 20, the person who's going to be the first person to set foot on Mars is out there, probably studying math or science. And it's really exciting to think about what that person's life will be like and how they will live after this big mission. Mars is probably in the mid-2030s. And so what we need to do now are proving ground missions that will get us ready for Mars. And it takes 6 pieces to get to Mars, and Boeing is building the SLS right now. NASA's current plan for Mars starts with SLS and Orion, the 2 pieces that get you in and out of the Earth's gravity well. If you're going to go to the moon or farther, you need a really big rocket to do that, and that's what the SLS is all about. To get you into a high orbit, and it's going to take us probably 5 or 6 SLS launches to be able to do the Mars mission. So we want to make sure that we've checked everything out and that we know that it's good to go before we actually leave for Mars. Because once we leave, we can't come back for over 2 years. And the reason for this is because it's the alignment of the planets. The way the planets revolve around the sun, it allows a window of opportunity to go from Earth to Mars basically every 2 years. Just to get to Mars, before you even land or anything, is going to take 7 or 8 months. The reality is you're going to be there for a year waiting until that window opens up to come back. And then it's going to take 7 or 8 months to come home. 2 more pieces are needed to go between Earth and Mars, a deep space tug of some kind, and we'll need a habitat. The deep space transportation is a solar electric tug with very large solar arrays, and it uses the power from the sun to drive the propulsion system, so they look like large sailing ships. And attached to the sailing ship will be a habitat where the crew will live. They'll ride in that habitat on the way to Mars, and then we'll leave the habitat in orbit when the crew goes down to the surface. And then the last two pieces that we'll need are the lander, and this lander will have an inflatable heat shield that will take the crew through the atmosphere and down. It'll drop that heat shield, and then the lander will land on the surface, much like the lunar lander did on the moon. And then we need a little rocket for them to get back up out of the Mars gravity well again. I think we'll be able to colonize Mars someday. It'll take time. It may take hundreds of years, but that's not unusual for humans. It's really about establishing a human foothold on the planet. It's a natural evolution of humanity to take this challenge on.
Is. Whether you want to go to Mars or eradicate diseases or become an inspiring teacher, just keep in mind that at some point it's going to require you to get out of Monaca, to leave your comfort zone and take a risk. When my son was younger, he was playing a lot of sports, and he had a no fear cap that had written on the inside band, "You can't steal second with your foot on first." Right? That's a philosophy that works for all sectors. Thanks very much.
Start your story at MDC. Be analytical. Be imaginative. Be a rising star. Be bold. Be connected. Be the solution. Be ready. What's your story? Be the best. Be you. Be MDC.
I have a very quick conversation. Thank you very much for the talk and for the great information you shared with us. So I've got a few questions here that I will ask, and then I will open it to the students and the audience if they have any questions to ask as well. You shared with us a lot of the success elements that helped you go from the public to the private sector. Things like building relationships, informing, and communication. What would you say are some of the challenges that you faced as you went from one sector to the other, and especially to the private sector? And what advice would you give our students as they look for careers in industry?
You know, the government is kind of a plodding institution, right? Some of us who've served in government were talking earlier about our experiences, and you can really accomplish a lot if you're in the right place, but it sometimes takes a lot of time, right? In private industry, you don't have that luxury of time, more so in the aerospace industry where your timelines are, 7 to 10 years to develop a plane. But in the food industry, right, PepsiCo, you know the story. We had an ad campaign once. It was in the market for 2 weeks. This was in the New York Times. I'm not telling tales out of school. Campaign for Tropicana orange juice, new advertising, new packaging. It's in the market for 2 weeks. Customers couldn't recognize the packaging on the shelf. Sales went down. 2 weeks, we pulled the whole campaign. How many millions of dollars, right? But it's very quick. It's a very quick-moving environment. So depending on where you are in the private sector, I think you have to focus on those results that are available for the next quarter rather than for the end of your administration, maybe 4 or 8 years later. I will say that I found, to my surprise actually, that there are a lot more similarities between the public and private sectors than I had expected. When I said about people really wanting to sort of do the right thing, yeah, you always find the jerk that it's not pulling his or her weight, and that's one similarity. They're everywhere. But in general, I find that people really they want their companies to succeed, right? That people are in it for more than just a paycheck, right? And sometimes I found that difficult to understand when I was growing up, right? But you go to our people on the assembly line in Boeing, and they really feel a tremendous responsibility for putting this aircraft together. I'll tell you a story. We had a delegation from Brazil up once to receive from our big customer down there, Gol Airlines, to receive a new aircraft. This is up in Seattle. And they had all their big executives up there and their chairman of the board and all, and they selected 3 workers from the assembly line to talk to these visitors about what their jobs were. And one woman got up and she was just shaking. I mean, she had paper and she could hardly hold it. And she was reading it, welcome to Seattle. And then she started talking about her job. And her job was to install an electrical box on day 5 assembly, which to me means, nothing. She knew everything there was about installing an electrical box on day 5 assembly. And that's the kind of person you want working on those aircraft we're all flying in, right? So I think, the similarities are greater than the differences. And one surprising thing I found was this commitment on both sides to do the right thing in general, if you will.
That's great. Thank you. A question on LATAM and competition. In LATAM, Boeing, of course, competes with very big airlines such as Airbus, other global companies, as well as local companies, Brazilian companies and others. What strategies does Boeing implement in order to succeed in these markets?
So Boeing didn't have any physical presence, permanent, in Latin America until I went down to open the office back in 2012. We went into the market, we sold aircraft to commercial customers largely, and then, you sell 60 aircraft, they're not going to buy 60 aircraft every year, so you wait a couple years, maybe sell some services, and then you go back. When we established a physical presence, it was in part because we knew that to do more in Latin America, we needed local partners. We weren't going to be able to come in there and just sell, just look at the region as a market. And one of the local partners, logically, was Embraer. We started out with a joint research center for sustainable aviation biofuel. As some of you may know, the commercial airline industry has established some very ambitious targets for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. The first target is they have to reach 0 emissions by 2020, and then by 2050 actually have to cut emissions by 50% using 2005 as your baseline. So these are ambitious targets, and there are 3 ways you can get there. One way is by having more efficient aircraft engines, and we're working with the engine manufacturers to do that. One way is to fly your plane more efficiently, right? And especially in things like landing, so you use your airspace better so you don't circle for an hour around the airport waiting for your landing slot. But you can't reach those targets unless you also use alternative fuels. And Brazil has a great history in its ethanol program, which was built for ground vehicles, right, back in the 70s and early 80s. So Embraer and Boeing established this joint research center to develop a commercially viable biofuels industry for aviation. Because you can fly airplanes now on biofuels. You can fly a 777, you can fly an F-18, one of our defense products. What you can't do is fly it at a price anybody can afford, right? So the industry has to be commercially viable. So that's how we started with Embraer, and now we have a host of collaborations. They are a great partner, and I was at a meeting a couple weeks ago in Washington. The Deputy Minister of Defense was there talking about how we could establish cooperation between U.S. and Brazilian industries. And we in Embraer have become the poster child for really good cooperation. It's made us look good in Brazil, too. So I think our differentiator for the region is really seeking out these partnerships.
That's great. So identifying local partnership that you can build relationship with, you can partner for future technologies would be a key for you to
yeah, and this is not
succeed.
something just new to Boeing, right? I mean, this is what I used to advise U.S. companies that would come into the embassy all the time and say, who are your allies here? Who's your local partner?
Yeah.
Who have you cultivated that shares your point of view and can advance that with the decision makers?
That's an example of something that you've took from the private sector, to the public sector, actually, and good advice there. Excellent. So one more question I'll ask, and I'll open it to the audience to ask questions as well. As you well know, the regulatory, political, economic environments and challenges in LATAM are quite large. And they create a bit of a risk to businesses that do business in Latin America. What are some of the strategies that Boeing implements in order to mitigate these risks?
Well, having the local partner is key, right? Yep. Somebody that when you see these risks arising and you need somebody to go in there and lobby government, advocate for government, it's a lot more effective if that person doesn't necessarily have Boeing written on the business cards, but if it's somebody coming from their local industry, local politicians whose interests would be affected by the decision too. You know, you build those alliances more than anything. I think and part of the alliances, and this is something that companies always struggle with, using the press effectively. How do you get your story out in the media in a way that's going to help you make your point and not expose your company to a lot of negative coverage you might not want, justified or not in some cases, right? So I think that the question of how to use the press is one that a lot of companies have difficulty with, and some just run away from, and I don't think that's reasonable. We point out success stories, right? We lost fighter jet competition in Brazil a couple years ago, and there were so many elements to why we lost the competition, but nonetheless, the decision went against us. They decided to buy the Swedish planes instead. If somebody wants a question about that, I'm happy to go into it in great detail. But we had plans for what we would do in Brazil if we had won that competition, working with local partners, creating jobs, and working with academia, and helping the Air Force develop capabilities that they did not yet have, that they would learn on our aircraft and then could take to other aircraft in their fleet. We're not doing that in Brazil, but we are doing it where we have a lot of sales, for example, India. Right? So I'll tell you, I don't go anywhere in Brazil where I don't say, you know, we have those 1,500 engineers working in India. If only we had been able to do that in Brazil. So I think the power of the positive example, too, can be powerful.
Thank you. All right, I'll open it to questions from the audience. So, please. There's a microphone.
Hello, my name is Leopoldo Coronado. I'm the Executive Director for Europe, South Florida. So the question is, to get to Mars and to build all these planes, you'll need a lot of talent. And as we work with the talented young adults and to create that pipeline of talent for you guys, what would be, in terms of technical skills, soft skills, professional skills, the gap that you are facing right now? So if you were going to give us advice, which areas would you like us to work so we can close those competencies gaps or capabilities gaps that you're finding?
Yeah, the war for talent is international now, and I think that's something that Boeing has just been learning over the last several years. Education, let me start with the kind of education programs we've supported in Brazil. Some of you may know the Brazilian government had a Science Without Borders project where it was a sandwich year between junior and senior years. University students traveled outside Brazil to attend a university, and then the idea was they would come back to Brazil and finish their schooling. And this was joint financed by the Brazilian government and companies that contributed to the program. We sponsored Science Without Borders for the 3 years it functioned, and we only worked with aerospace or aeronautical engineering students because that's what we need. We need engineers. We need specialized engineers. I'll tell you, it was a great frustration to some of us. Ana Paula Fajeda, our communications director, is here, and she and I worked closely on this program. So because we were so specific, we didn't have as many students as maybe some other companies had, but what we offered them was not just we'll pay your scholarship, but we'll pay your scholarship, we'll give you a Boeing mentor to work with your academic advisor throughout your year in the States, and you have an 8-week internship at Boeing in Seattle at the conclusion of the program. And then you have a week traveling around visiting Boeing factories in the States. So the first year we had 15 students, right? 3 women. The second year, we had 35 students, more or less, 3 women. The third year, we had more or less 25 students, 3 women, right? Getting women involved in science, technology, engineering, particularly aerospace and aeronautical engineering, was really a challenge for us. It was like we had a quota. Oh, yeah, we're the 3 women. We'll pick them first, and then we'll go with the others. So engineers, very specialized engineers, are something very important for us. And if you go on the Boeing website, Boeing.com, and you see careers at Boeing, you'll see what we're looking for. We also have, obviously, a need for business, skilled business students, people who are accustomed to doing business outside the United States. For a long time, Boeing was a company that worked the way we did in Latin America. We produce in the United States to export. And we're still the United States' largest exporter. But increasingly, we're operating outside the U.S. as well. And so business people who are comfortable in other business environments are important to us. And we have an international business intern program also. So, if you're at all interested, Boeing.com, and it'll give you some great ideas. Careers at Boeing is the specific link there on that site.
My name is Steven. I'm a student here. I used to work on F-15s as an aircraft mechanic in the Air Force. And one of the things that I noticed as we would work on different aspects of the mechanical parts of the jet is that certain things were inefficient. Granted, these jets were created back in the 80s and late 70s, but I came across a TED Talk that was talking about intuitive AI and algorithms that mimic nature, and that Airbus is pioneering in this to create a different type of aircraft that essentially minimizes the weight of the aircraft to allow more efficiency as far as the fuel, as you were saying earlier. Is that something that Boeing is pioneering in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There is so much going on the tech side. I have to say it's a great time to be in aerospace because there is so much going on. We have a whole branch, it's called Horizons X, where we're doing some generic growth out of Horizon X, but we're really looking at startups. We're going around identifying companies that are working in AI or fourth generation manufacturing, autonomous vehicles. We have a competition we're sponsoring right now with a group called Go Fly, and this is www.gofly.com. And it's a 2-year competition for someone who will invent an autonomous personal flying vehicle. Right? So it will take you, the passenger, at least one person, at least 25 miles, right? And you have to do it quietly. You have to do it without a negative effect on the environment, emissions free. You can use whatever propulsion you want. But the competition will go over this 2-year period. There are certain milestones. You have to give your design in at one point, and then there's a prototype requirement, and obviously the best designs will move forward and others will not. $2 million prize. Students are prime sources of, I think, ideas for this competition. GoFly.com, right? And when I was a kid, I used to watch the Jetsons, and they promised that in the future we would have jetpacks, right? We'd all be flying around on our own. The future for the Jetsons was like the year 2000, and I'm still waiting. So please go out and invent this vertical, right? Vertical takeoff, fly 25 miles, and drop you some. You could use this to come to school.
And fight the traffic in Brazil and other places.
I mean, I'm sort of making light of it. This is going to happen. And with luck, this will happen first at Boeing through this competition. It is quite possible. And we already have 800 submissions. So if you have an idea and you're not yet in there, here's your time. When's it?
There we go.
Is there a date when the submission, the first phase closes? Do you know what that is? Around March. Okay, so you have a few months, but it's probably going to take you a few months.
Thank you, Donna. There was a question in the back. Yes? Yes.
Madam Ambassador, as a Brazilian, I would like to thank you very much for all the great job you have done between the two countries under your tenure in Brazil.
Muito obrigada.
Como brasileiro, minha saudação.
Obrigada.
Thank you to the college, Miami-Dade College. Congratulations, great job. I am a professor at the Mechanical and Aerospace Department at the University of Miami. And we have seen a trend in the market today of having merger and acquisition between companies becoming big corporations. One example in the aircraft industry is this recent integration between Bombardier and Airbus. Boeing is a leading company in this aircraft industry. How do you see the impact and the trend of this merger and acquisition process in the competition in your market, in aircraft market, aircraft, and also the implication in innovation and technology and job creation? Muito obrigado.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the competitive landscape is changing. You know, for a long time, we had the duopoly. You could buy your commercial aircraft from Boeing, or you could buy it from Airbus, right? And now there are new competitors in the market. We had Embraer in Brazil, Bombardier from Canada, now Comac from China. They flew their first large single-aisle aircraft in May, the C919. They're going to be a very formidable competitor in the future. You know, one way we've been, and we're the largest of the aerospace companies, by the way, but that doesn't mean that we can continue to operate autonomously, or this is why we need the kind of partnerships we have with Embraer, but it also means strengthening our supply chain. And we've done that globally in many different ways. If you follow the aviation news this week, you might have seen an announcement about Boeing and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, right? Well, Mitsubishi makes the wings for that 787 that we were talking about, right? And the 787 was 4 years late to market. And one of the issues was our suppliers were given much more responsibility than they had ever had for producing an aircraft, and they really weren't ready, even though they said they were, right? Because, you know, Boeing comes to you and says, hey, can you make this part of the aircraft? And we don't want you to just produce it. We want you to engineer it. We want you to design it, and then you produce it. Can you do that? Sure, we can do it, right? Well, maybe you weren't quite as ready as you thought, and we learned from that experience. We got to get out there with our suppliers from day one and make sure that we bring them along every step of the way as we develop new aircraft. So that's one way. But, you know, also I think these, looking at what the market needs and making sure that we're responding with our products. We talked about the efficiency, right? So the new 737 MAX just started flying in May. We gave our first, handed over the first one to an Asian, Malaysian company in May. The launch customer here in the region is going to be Aerolíneas Argentinas, which gets its first 737 MAX at the end of November. This MAX, and the 737 is the best-selling aircraft of all time, right? This new MAX, new 737, is 14% more fuel efficient than the 800, which is the next-gen model. It's just, we're always looking at ways to be responsive to the market. You know, we talk about, it's an interesting balance because, you know, you have a chief innovation officer. We love to innovate. You know, there's so many fascinating things going on in aerospace. But it's got to be innovation for a purpose because we've got customers, and customers have passengers. And we've got to innovate for that market and for what they will pay for. You know, we could fly supersonically today, right? Nobody wants to pay those tickets to go to Europe, right? So how do we make sure that technology is responsive and affordable? It's a real challenge in the industry.
First of all, it's a pleasure to meet you. To hear your accomplishments really does give hope to a lot of us students here. My name is Candy Cabrera, and basically I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned the importance of education, not only in the US but around the world. What advice would you give to an education and business administration major to improving education around the world?
I think being a good example is probably, it's kind of a cop-out too, but I'll start with that. Be a good example. You know, make sure that you value, if you value your education, make sure people understand that you value that education and why, right? I know when I think about it, maybe that's not as easy as initially occurred to me. To make sure that you send that message when you talk to young people in your family, younger people. Why are you in school? Why don't you just go out and get a job? Being able to convey that message about why it's important to study, I think. When you're out in the workforce, we support junior achievement in some places too. If you can go into local schools, and we're talking about in some cases, to the elementary schools, preschools, and just talk about discipline and respect. And in our case, because we're STEM focused, this is where we can really add value besides giving money. We're a technology company. So if you go, and some of you may know Sid the Science Kid, it's a Discovery Channel project. So working with Sid, go into to public preschools and just talk to 4-year-olds about what happens when a leaf falls off the tree, or why animals have different kinds of fur, different kinds of skin coverings. I think just giving at that age to those kids, that's how you can make a difference. So be an example and then walk that talk, I guess. Does that make sense?
Hello, my name is Lucas, and I have a question about your education path. Your studies were more oriented towards politics and economics, or was it more oriented with business? And how did you get started in the public service? Like, how did you get in? Thank you.
So I was a multidisciplinary social science major. And if I had known that someday I would become an ambassador, it would have been a lot easier to answer my dad's question, which was always, what kind of job do multidisciplinary social scientists get? Right? So and it was a mix of economics and political science and history. And I got into the public service because and this is a true story, when I was 12 years old, I watched a beauty pageant, and Miss Kansas said she was studying languages and wanted to go in the Foreign Service. And seriously, I thought, sounds like something that would get me out of Monaca, Pennsylvania. So that was my goal, and I took the test, and I was lucky enough to pass it. And I was actually in law school at the time. I took a 2-year leave of absence from law school to go into the Foreign Service. And I had a wonderful career. I spent most of my time in Latin America, in part because of family situation, but also because, I'm not Latina in this life, but I clearly was in a previous life, and I just feel really comfortable here.
And you speak Spanish and Portuguese extremely well. I was quite impressed.
Portañol. Puro.
Portañol?
Portañol puro, yeah.
Thank you very much, Donna. Do we have we have time for one more question?
My question to you is, you mentioned earlier that you had gone to abroad, right, for your experience after your first semester, right? Something like that. But I wanted to know, essentially, if you had an idea of, I guess for our generation, it's, I guess, lacking a sense of understanding of international. Would you recommend that, what is your stance on this generation and being more progressive in becoming international?
I'm somewhat surprised by that question because we're in Miami, for crying out loud. Where could there be a better opportunity to develop an international orientation and understanding of countries beyond the United States than right here? And it's not just Latin America. You can start with Latin America, but there are people from all over the world where this is truly a global city. And, not to dump on any place else in the United States, but this is not Lincoln, Nebraska, right? I mean, we have just this great chance of taking advantage of cultures when musical groups come in from all around the world, fashion here, right? I just think that all you have to do here is really live in Miami, but don't live casually, live purposefully. Say, I'm going to take advantage of everything this community has that will let me be more of a global citizen. And I think you'll not only become a global citizen, you'll have a whole lot of fun doing it.
That's very true. I've lived in so many different places in the United States, and Miami is very unique in an amazing way. You can learn about all kinds of different cultures just living here.
Yeah.
yeah, and interacting with the people here. So absolutely.
You show a chart very early on in which it showed our decline as a nation in certain fields, math, science, and some others. Intelligence, development, technology is not unique to the U.S., especially in a global world where you have to go everywhere to find the very best. Miami is a prime example of what immigrants can do to a community. Miami, I think most people that were here today who spoke had an accent, with few exceptions. If there was one, I didn't hear one. So there's talent from all over the place, and this is what made Miami what it is today. This is also what made our country what it is today. We see it in Israel. I spent a lot of time in Israel. And sometimes I ask them, why is it that I find the most beautiful women in Tel Aviv? And the answer is a combination of cultures. But also, in Israel, you have a tremendous tech startup world, second only to the US in the number of IPOs that are created. Technologically, they're advanced much more than in a tiny little country of a few million people. Today, we're talking about reducing the number of immigrants coming to the US. That's going to be a shortage for you to hire at Boeing and for every other major employer, and has an impact not only on your profitability in the business, but also in the job creation for those that are seeking jobs there. How are you dealing with that prospectively as to you see a decline of talent coming in as mandated by the current trend of the nation?
Yeah, it's a concern, especially because a lot of these engineers, and we're going to lose a lot of engineers over the next 10 years in particular as baby boomers retire. And we are going to have to go outside the United States to find this talent. And I think the current climate has made it more difficult to plan that future. We've got to adjust the way we were thinking about how we replace those engineers. I think we're aware of it. I'm not sure we found the political answer to it. I know, when I talk about alliances, we work, for example, with our CEOs in the Business Roundtable, and he's very active there. And the Business Roundtable, I'm proud to say, made a very clear statement about dreamers, that people who are here, working here, and studying here should be allowed to stay here, right? I think making sure that the voice of the business community is heard in DC as these decisions are made. And there are a lot of decisions being made that are important, not just in education, not just in engineering, but we're big supporters of free trade. We're the US's largest exporter. We're only going to be able to export if we buy other countries' goods, if we also import, if there is an exchange of goods and services and talent. So I think we're facing questions in a much more serious way now that maybe, just a few years ago, we didn't think we're going to be at the top of the priority list right now. That's the right question. It's all about people, and if it's all about the relationships, if we don't have that woman building that electric box on day 5, that plane is not going to fly. Okay.
Thank you very much, Donna. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you all for attending. We'll see you at the next speaker series.